Hi, Terry Rowland from T Rose Studios. Today we're going to bind this quilt. This is my Kool Kaleidoscope quilt by Ricky Timms. I showed you the other day how I squared this quilt up. Well, now I'm ready to actually bind it. Now I did go around and did a running stitch all the way around the outside edge, really close to the edge. That just holds all of my layers together and just makes it easier for when I'm putting the binding on. So I encourage you to add that stay stitch all the way around the outside edge, as close to the edge as you can. So now that I'm ready, first thing I have to do is how much binding do I need? I will measure all sides of it, and it is 46 inches. And I know all of the sides are 46 inches because I've measured it before I got on here. So 46 times 4, plus I add approximately 15 inches to that measurement, which brings it up to 200 inches for this particular quilt. Those inches help me turn the corners and join my binding. I hate to be this much short when I've gone all the way around with my binding. I would rather have this much left over than to be this much short. So that's how I figured it out. Add up all 4 sides, add 15 inches. That gives me that buffer, and I know I'm not going to be short. So now I've got my binding strips cut. Now you can do your binding whatever width you like. I prefer a 2.5 inch binding, as long as I don't have points close to the outside edge of my quilt, which I don't. I've got a border on mine. If I have points that are too close to the outside edge, I'm going to do a 2.25 inch binding. I have cut mine at 2.5 inches, and I'm going to show you how I join them. Now, I'm using a batik, so they look the same on both sides. I'm going to put the pretty side or the right side up. I'm going to set the other piece that I'm joining right side together. Now, if you noticed, I didn't line them up right along the edges, because you have to sew from this point to that point. And it's really hard to see that point. I overlap them ever so slightly, like 1/4 inch. I'm going to take a ruler. Sorry. Let me get my right angle again. And I'm going to draw a line from this little V to that little V. And I can do that with a sliver of soap, which marks it really well. I could use a chalk sew line marker, but I find my soap works a little bit better than what these chalk pencils do. On these dark bindings, it's really hard to find a marking pencil that actually works. So a sliver of soap works really well. Now, if you're a pinner, I would pin here. Oh, I've moved it. Let me do it again. And I'm going to take this over and put it under the needle. Now I'm going to shorten my stitch length to about a 2. My machine automatically puts it at a 2.5. I feel that that's just a little bit too wide. And I'm just sewing on that line. Now I'm going to chain piece my binding. I'm going to take this and make sure I've got my right side up. And I'm going to configure that V again. And I'm just going to set that underneath there. And I'm going to go from the first V down to this one. And I just eyeball that. If you are more comfortable with marking it, by all means mark it. And if you hit that V exactly where it stops and starts, your binding will be perfectly straight. Again, overlapping. I'm going to set that in, come in right where that first V is. And I'm going to come to this side. All right. So now I have chain pieced. I'm going to remove those. If I open that up, this should be perfectly straight. Okay. So now I'm going to just trim my chains, and we need to press those seams open. Now most people trim them at 1/4 of an inch and then press them, but you'll find that it's way easier to bring this over to your pressing mat and press this when those little triangle edges are on. And then I will trim them. Now I can trim them with my rotary cutter, or I can trim them with just scissors. So I'll just show you that. So I can flip those back up and do a 1/4 inch seam here, or a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to take that little dog ear off because that'll just get in my way when I'm doing my binding. I'm going to come along here. As I say, you could take your ruler, set it on the 1/4 inch, and where's my rotary cutter? On the 1/4 inch, and snip that off. And again, take that edge and that edge off. One more left.
Would the extra pieces go in your scrap?
Yes, the extra pieces do go into my scrap bucket, so I'll just set them aside. And again, trimming off those little dog ears, get them out of the way. So now my binding is almost ready. So I like to fold my binding in half, and I've got a little tool that I built to do just that. This is what I call my binding board. I've got two very long needles that are positioned the width of my iron apart. That's important, and I'll show you that in a second. If I'm using my big iron, these needles would just be farther apart. So the very first step I do is I want to fold it wrong sides together. And I'm going to give that just a little, line up those edges perfectly. I'm going to give that a good press. And now I'm going to feed this through my needles. Now this center section that is exposed, the needle that is exposed, is exactly the same width as my binding being folded in half. So I'm just going to lift that up, pull that in, lift that up, pull that in. So you can see that fills that gap where the needle is exposed. That's going to help me to pull this through, press my binding, and if you notice how I'm holding my fingers on this end, I can maneuver this to line up those edges perfectly. So once I'm all set, I take my binding and I throw it on the floor on the other side. The table will help bring the binding up so that it's not twisted, and I won't have to stop and rearrange the binding to do the folding. So now that I'm set up, I'm ready to actually iron my binding. I'm just going to get it so that I don't have any tension on that iron. And I'm going to just set it on top, and I am going to, I just need to get this a little bit closer to me there. So now I can see if my edges are even here. And as long as I'm pulling out and feeding in straight and not going cockeyed, it will give me a beautiful fold on my binding. This is a super quick way. I'm not burning my fingers. When I've got my iron on there, it is stopped by that needle. It doesn't pull off the table. Yes, I've seen people that take these needles and put it in their ironing board, but you tend to get a lot of holes in your ironing board, and I leave my iron down for an extended period of time. So you could get a burn in your ironing board cover. I don't care if I burn this. You can see how quick and easy this is. I can do a king size in a really short time. Oops. Just about to the end of pressing my binding for this project. All right, done. So now I'm going to show you how I roll my binding so that it doesn't twist when I'm actually applying it. So I call it the Terry twist. I do have a separate video showing how to do this. So I'll just show you how I do it really quickly. I pinch between my finger and my thumb, and I'm going to roll this around and flop it over my pinky. I'm going to bring this around, and if you can see, I'm creating a figure 8. Now, every time that I'm doing this, the fold is on the same side and the raw edge is on the same side. I'm never twisting it so that it's like twisting. I want it to lay flat, and if you can tell, I'm not pulling on this. I'm just basically laying it on top. It's very loose. There's no tension on it, and I just continue to roll my hand back and forth. You can see I'm doing kind of a rocking motion. Once you get it, it's quite easy. And I can go really fast doing this, but I'm going to just do it really slow for you. Now I'm getting close to the end. I'm going to stop right there, and I'm just going to pull my fingers out. You can see it wasn't very tight. And I'm going to loosely wrap this around here. And I'm just going to tuck the end under, or you can take a safety pin and pin the end. So now my binding is all neat and tidy. When I'm ready to use it, I want to go into the center, and I want to pull it out of the center. Let me just tuck that in again. When I pull it out, it looks like it's going to twist, but it straightens out. Looks like it's going to twist, but it straightens out. So it always comes out flat, and I usually leave it on my lap as I'm attaching my binding and just pull it out as I need it, or I can throw it on the floor underneath me. I'm not going to, it's not going to roll away. It's not been done on a ball, or it just comes out perfectly straight. There's no twisting. You don't have to fight with your binding trying to get it to line up. So that's how I prepare my, I'm just going to re-roll that so that it's all nice and tidy again. And I'll do it at real speed. So again, I've pinched, I've flopped it, and now I'm just going to do my figure 8. that under and pull it out of the center. All right, now I'm ready. All right, where do you start? I am going to be sewing my binding to the front of my quilt. And then when I'm done, I will be rolling it to the back and doing hand stitching. So I like to start in the center with my binding.
Center bottom?
Center bottoms, yes. Center bottom for my binding. And I want to leave a good 8 to 10 inches, which is approximately there. Now, I do a 2.5 inch binding. So I like to do a 3/8 inch seam all the way around mine. And I'm just going to pin that. Mine is wider than 1/4 inch. Everybody says you sew your binding on with 1/4 inch. If you're using 2¼ inch binding, yes, you can sew your binding on with a 2¼ inch. I'm doing 2.5. I want this, when I flip it around to the other side, you can see my pin there. I want my binding to just barely cover that stitch line, which is 3/8 inch, or just a hair under 3/8 inch. So I always pin it and just see if I've kind of got it where I want it. I'm going to just go 1 stitch in from there, and that's where I'm going to set up to actually sew all the way around my binding. Okay. And it's nice to have a table set up beside that holds the weight of your quilt. Now, I'm actually going to move my needle over. I have that option on my machine. So I'm using the side of my presser foot, and I've moved my needle over to where I had my pin. And I'm going to start sewing my binding on. As you can see, I've got my that binding bundle right on my lap, and I'm only pulling it out as I need it. And I'm going to continue sewing till I'm 2 inches away from the corner. Approximately there. Now I'm going to stop with my needle down, and I'm going to come to the end of my binding, and I'm going to do that first fold that we always do when we get to doing the corner. Now, if you've noticed, I've got a perfect miter going right to the corner of my quilt. That's super important. Now I'm going to unfold that, and just to make it easier for you to see, I'm going to mark that. So that is my miter corner that I am aiming for when I get to this corner. I don't have to measure 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch from this edge. All I have to do is sew to that line, which is what I will do. And I want to stop with my needle down. Okay, that's perfectly on that line. While my needle's down, I'm going to rearrange my quilt so that it is going to be set up for my next line of stitching. I'm going to raise my needle. I'm going to pull it forward. You can see I stopped right on that line. So I'm just barely in front of the presser foot. I'm going to refold that first fold that we just finished doing, and then I'm going to, just need a little more binding. I'm going to fold this edge so that it's even with this side of the quilt. If you've noticed, this side, those 2 folds that came back on themselves are right on top of each other. And on this side, all of the raw edges are along the new side that we're going to be going down. So now I'm going to push my quilt back underneath my needle so that my presser foot is lined up along this edge of the quilt sandwich. Then I'm going to come up here and I'm going to just tug my thread, because when we pulled it forward, we had a little bit of slack in that, and it will create a loop which kind of gets in the way. So I like to just pull it back, then put my pressure foot down. My needle should be coming into that fold right along the top of that quilt sandwich, and then I can just continue sewing. I'm going to sew all the way to the other side and stop 2 inches from the end, and we will do that again. Okay, we're getting close to where that 2-inch away from the corner is. So I'm going to stop with my needle down. I'm going to do that miter fold, that first step of turning a corner, so that my miter is pointing directly into that corner. I'm opening that up. I'm going to just mark that fold line just to make it easier. I'm going to continue on, and I'm going to stop right on that line. Lift the presser foot, turn so that my quilt is positioned to go the next direction. Lift the needle, pull it forward only as far as I need to get that folded edge right along the top edge. Again, I'm making sure that that fold is level with this side. I'm making sure that these two are stacked on top of each other and not askewed like that, because you won't get a perfect mitered corner if they are. You need those stacked on top of each other, and then this side needs to be perfectly straight with your raw edge. Again, I'm going to put it back under the needle. I'm going to just ever so slightly pull that slack back. Then I can put my presser foot down and continue sewing. Now I did have a sample here that I'm going to show you those steps, and it might be a little bit easier to see on this lighter fabric than it is on my dark fabric. So I'm stitching along here. I'm going to get within a couple of inches of the end. So this is still under my needle here. I'm going to come over and I'm going to do the fold of the first fold of the binding. Open it up, mark it. I could use a pencil on this one because this is a light binding, but I can actually see that fold line, and I'm going to stitch all the way to that corner. I'm going to stop with my needle down. I would pull it forward. I would do my first fold, fold it back on itself, lining up the fold with this side of my quilt, making sure that these two are stacked on top of each other and that my raw edges are all along the side. I would pull this back just so that this is under the needle, and I would pull the slack and continue sewing. So I hope that kind of shows it a little better on a lighter color than on my really dark fabrics. So I'm going to continue all the way around. We'll probably speed this up, and I'll talk to you on the other end. All right, so now if you noticed, I kind of did just a a finger width to find out where I wanted to stop. I know this is 8 inches on my hand, so it's my quick 8-inch measure to know where I wanted to finish. So I'm just going to do just a little bit of a back stitch there, cut my thread so that I can actually join my 2 ends. Now it's super hard to see this because I'm using dark, but I need to have this laying flat on both sides, and I need my overlap. I need an overlap to be able to join these together. Now the perfect number is whatever the width of your binding was. So mine started out at 2.5 inches. So I'm just going to pull my binding around, and I've got it lined up with my starting binding, and I can see I need to cut it off right there. As you can see, I didn't have a ton left over, but I did have enough to pull it around so that I could do just that quick measure. So now I know I have got this overlapped 2.5 inches. That's the perfect overlap for joining my binding. So now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just take my sandwich and I'm going to pin it together. That'll help me have some slack so that I can join my binding together. Now, you don't want to twist this. We have to make sure that we don't have a twist. So quite often I will pin that until you figure out how the best way to do it. I usually have mine, and I'm just, because I've got this pinned together, it looks like it's extra long. I pick this one up and I twist it and I will sew it together here. Now that's very awkward to explain how to do that. So I'm going to just take 2 pins and I'm going to put them parallel to my stitching line. Now my stitching line is going to be just like, where's my binding board here? So you can see this. I'm going to do this exactly the same way that we joined our binding. I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to create my stitching line. By pinning those in, I'm not fighting with the ends, and pinning this together, I've got a little bit of slack so that it's a little easier to do. I want to show you that if I stitched it right here, and I pulled it out, you can see that I don't have a twist in this. So that is the direction I want to sew my seam, and that's exactly where I want to sew my seam. If you pin baste your seam, you can double check that and you're not having to rip it out, because it's really easy to get this twisted. So that's a little hint just to do that. Then I'm going to take those pins and I'm going to put them again parallel. I don't put them in this way because I would have to move them to sew. I don't have to move those and they're not going to shift. So I'm going to take that, and then you kind of have to maneuver your quilt to get yourself back over here. Get yourself lined up. And again, I'm going to sew from that V to that V. Looks good, I think. Take those pins out. I can do a double check here. I'm going to take this pin out. Now I want to show you something. Because I overlapped those and extended them past, 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch, This binding is just a tad shorter than what the quilt sandwich is. I can pull that straight. If I line those up on the edges, quite often this is a little bit longer than this, and you get a pleat in your binding. I call it my snap test, and I can get that to snap into place so that there's no extra binding on that edge. All right, back to my iron. I'm going to just press that open. That out of the way. I'm going to trim this 1/4 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch. Save those corners. Snip off those bunny ears there. Okay, now I'm going to be able to go back to where I finished sewing and continue sewing to where I started sewing, and then my binding is going to be attached all the way around my quilt. So I don't do a back stitch. I start about 3 or 4 stitches and go over the where I finished. And I'm just going to hold that together in the center and continue that perimeter sewing of my binding to my top. And I sewed about 3 or 4 stitches over top of where I had started from. Don't need to back stitch. Just going to lift that up, and you can see it's totally attached all the way around. Now the very next thing I like to do is I like to press my binding out. I'm all right. I'm still on my quilt sandwich. But yes, you could take it to your ironing board and do that. I'm going to do that all the way around. Now I've got a really important tip. I want to reduce some bulk in the corners. When we're folding our binding around this corner, we create a little bit of bulk in those corners. And I've got a little trick to reduce that bulk. Let me just get this. Let's try and hold it over to here. Right, I'm just going to fold the quilt sandwich out in the back. Can you see this itty bitty little triangle here? That's 4 layers that is 4 layers of fabric in there. I'm going to just snip the very top of that, and I'm going to pull the binding back here. Oop, I need a little more. Now can you see that? I'm going to get rid of that. That little triangle is 4 layers of fabric there. It's not needed in there. Now, if you pinch that, you've reduced all of that bulk. So when you're pulling this all the way around to the back side and maneuvering your fabric, this corner is going to be way less bulky, and you're going to be able to get a really nice square corner here by removing that. Now I'm going to show you that on my sample because it'll be way easier to see. This sample is oversized just for this purpose. Let's see, we're going to do this corner. So we've done the binding, we've folded, and if you fold the binding up and the quilt sandwich out of the way, that is the triangle I'm talking about. I want to stitch that right, yep, sorry, cut that right to the corner. And you need a really sharp pair of scissors. Mine are really dull. So that I can get right to the corner with there we go. Then I can get all of my binding out of the way and my quilt sandwich out of the way, and I can cut that triangle out. So you can see that triangle when it's folded is 2 layers here and 2 layers there. Now you always want your binding to be nice and square in that corner. If you don't have a square foundation, you're not going to have a square corner. I've seen people that reduce bulk by cutting this way. Well, there's no way your quilt corners can be square if you cut the square off the corners. So this is super important that this is nice and square. When I go to fold everything around to the other side, you can see I've got a beautiful miter on that side. I'm going to pull this side over, and then I'm going to pull this side over. Get it so that I can get it around there. And you can see how we can create a beautiful miter corner on this side too. And you don't have the bulk. All right, I'm going to just do the demonstration on how I do my backing on my little piece, because it'll be way easier for you to see. I'm going to start with I like a single layer of thread when I'm hand stitching my binding on. I've put a hefty knot in the back side of this, and I'm going to take my needle on the binding side and I'm going to bury it inside the binding. Then I'm going to do just a little bit of a stitch right here just to secure it, make sure that that knot isn't going to pull through. Then I'm going to bring my binding around, and I've used a contrasting thread so you can actually see where I've stitched my binding on. And I want this side to just cover that stitching. I'm going to just take a stitch into my binding fold, and I'm going to come directly parallel to it and go into my quilt sandwich just on that side of that stitch line. And I'm going to go about 1/8, just a little over 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to, of course, I pulled my needle off, my thread off my needle. Isn't this always the way it happens? Okay, there we go. Pulling the binding around, I want it really taut all the way around. I'm going to sew parallel, go about 1/8 of an inch, come through the fold, parallel, 1/8 of an inch through the fold. So I've got just itty bitty little tiny ladder stitches, I call them, because they look like rungs on a ladder. And I'm going to continue until I get to the corner. I'm not using clips, I'm not using pins. I want to just hold it in place. Little ladder stitch up through the fold. I'm right beside that stitch line, ladder stitch. Pull that again. Where'd my needle go? And I'm going to sew right to the far stitch line, which is right there. When I get to the corner, I want to actually put a little bit of a knot stitch. So I'm doing one little stitch right there. I'm going to throw my thread through that little thread loop a couple of times and then pull it tight. That actually knotted that so that I can come up and get ready to go the other direction. I want to make sure that I get this nice and tight so that when I turn this corner, I can create a beautiful miter. There we go. Pretty happy with that. I'm just going to hold it with that. So that's what I want to create, is a beautiful miter on this side. So now I'm going to pinch that. I'm going to position myself so that I can actually put that thread through where that miter is. I'm going to do another lock stitch there before I head the other direction. So that gives it a nice lock stitch so that I can get myself set up to go this way. Now, if you're doing any competition quilts, they really like to see a stitch or two in this little folded area. So I'll just show you how I would do that. I'm going to come through my quilt sandwich and come up to the halfway point. I'm going to do a teeny tiny little stitch right there. Oops, I didn't want to pull that all the way through. I wanted to leave that little loop. And I'm going to go through that loop, give it a tug, and now I'm going to go back through my sandwich over to my side. And you can see that has been tacked down right there, which is what they like to see for competition quilting. Now, this is oversized, so your regular binding would only be this wide, so your stitch would be right in the center. If I was doing a wide binding like this on a quilt, you'd have to put 2 or 3 of those locking stitches in that miter. Now I'm going to just continue doing my 1/8 of an inch all the way along. It's not a bad idea every 10 or 20 stitches to throw one of those locking stitches in, just in case your binding comes loose. It's not going to unravel all the way around your quilt. So if let's say I've finished doing 10 or 12, 15, whatever your magic number is, you can just take a teeny tiny little stitch in there. And again, find your little loop. I'm trying to get it so it's not twisted. I'll do it the next one. Take a teeny tiny little loop and go through it twice to give that a good lock, and then continue going along. This is also how you would end your stitching. When you're finished, you're going to do a lock stitch, and then I like to go back through my quilt sandwich and bring it out a little ways away so the tail is underneath, hidden away in between all the layers. I can snip that off and it disappears in between the 2 layers. So that's a quick how I'm going to actually finish this. You don't need to watch me do the whole thing. I'll be rolling this around and doing that stitching all the way around. Paying attention in the corners to make sure that I've got them mitered really well, and make sure that you trim all of those corners. What?
Thanks for watching.
Oh, thanks for watching. I hope you've learned a few tips about binding your quilts.